Ask the Podcast Coach for April 29th, 2017.
Let's get ready to podcast.
There it is. It's that fun-filled music to try to get you up on a Saturday morning. It's time for Ask the Podcast Coach, where you get your podcast questions answered live. I'm Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. What we're going to talk about today, along with, of course, your questions, things like, how do you podcast when you don't want to? Where'd my audience go? How about cross promotion? Is that a good idea? GarageBand versus Audition. What do I do with this long interview? As well as some tips on Patreon. And here to help me discuss all those is the one and only from theaverageguy.tv, Jim Cullison. How's it going, buddy?
Greetings, Dave. Happy Saturday morning to you. Wow, you changed up the intro on that. That's pretty nice. Little preview. I like that.
Well, it's that whole, on one hand, we do kind of wing it on this show because we're always following the path of the live chat room, which you can find out at askthepodcastcoach.com/live. So we're always kind of following those folks. But for the record, we have things to talk about in the event nobody shows up. Because
it's planned winging, right? I mean,
it's planned winging it.
I bet in about 2 minutes we came up with about 20 different topics. If you listen to us in the pre-show on Mixler, so if you go to mixler.com//podcast coach, in the mornings, you can kind of hear the first, out of 7 or 10 minutes, right, of what we do kind of in pre-show. Yeah. And I think between the two of us, we probably have 8 to 10 ideas of kind of things to go through. And, you know, it's, you say this all the time. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to podcasting. We end up in a show like this. We end up talking about the same things over and over again. I think that's okay because many of them have kind of a new twist. You know, we're going to talk a little bit later over at Podcasters Group Therapy. Nick mentioned something about Patreon. That was a new twist to it. So it's those kinds of things where you think, oh, it's the same thing, Patreon. We talk about it all the time with a new twist. So we'll look forward to that.
Well, there was a question. We can actually kind of hit that now. There was a question in one of the, what I do is I go out to a lot of the Facebook groups that have all sorts of people talking about podcasting to see what people are talking about. And that's really one of the things. I'm listening to a book right now. He said, pulling up his phone. And it's one of these, the big guru guy he's written like 8 million books, whose name is escaping me, John Maxwell. How to influence people, blah, blah, blah. Let me see if I can. I tell you what, Audible has a weird app. They make it rather hard. You have to, I think, double click the icon to get it to play. Yeah. How to influence people, make a difference in the world, blah, blah, blah. John Maxwell. And for the most part, they should just rename the book Don't Be a Weenie, because that's really
be nice to people. That's the key, right?
Be nice to people. But they said one of the keys is to listen. A lot of people aren't very good listeners. And so that's one of the things I do is I go out on Saturday mornings as well as during the week, and I try to listen to what people are talking about to see if that would be a good idea. And somebody asked, is there a correlation between audience size and Patreon earnings? And I was like, boy, that's a good question. They were all kind of saying, boy, I'd love to see that. And I said, but really the first thing you have to keep in mind is what you're doing with Patreon or PayPal or whatever you're doing for monetization. Is step one is get an audience. And I think sometimes we focus too much on the monetization before we've actually got the audience. And I realize you kind of want to have that in place so that when you do get an audience, we should always say that again, if that's something you want to do, you don't have to monetize your show. But I think sometimes we do get a little preoccupied. I've seen people get preoccupied with monetization, and that's where I always throw out you typically don't tune into a infomercial on purpose unless there's absolutely nothing else on. And that's really, to me, I think monetization is just a really interesting dance, because if you do too much of it, then you take away from the content, where if it's just a giant commercial. But on the other hand, if you don't ask, you don't get. So Jim, I've yet to listen to the Podcasters Group Therapy episode.
Yeah, Nick does a nice job. By the way, nice call out here to Ask Podcast Coach. So those between these two shows, I really enjoy Corey and Nick on that. Tani's been off. They're having trouble getting her scheduled, but I enjoy their take on podcasting because they're not really doing it to make money on, it's a community show. And so what you hear, kind of hopefully what you hear like with us, is that it's just kind of honest what it is, anyways. I appreciate those guys. So Nick had mentioned that he had set up a sponsorship on Patreon. I think what it does is it's $100, and you get to be the sponsor on the show for that month. So someone can come in very simply and very easily sponsor your show 1 month at a time. Flat, no CPM, flat rate, $100, boom, you're in. And I thought, wow, that's a really simple, low cost when we think about people who are advertising. $100 is not a lot if they're thinking about doing it. And if they're in your niche, they can simply sign up and support you on Patreon. And it's just a quick, easy way to get, as I thought about it, a quick, easy way to get a sponsor in. And I think you'd be very clear about, hey, this $100 is going to get you a 30-second spot and, whatever, right? Whatever you're going to include. You could even, if that's successful, you could even bump that up and say, hey, 500, we'll get you a banner and, some of those kinds of things. So I hadn't thought about using Patreon in that way to think about attracting sponsors from a advertising standpoint. And then it makes the accounting nice and easy, right? They can bill it. You can get it. You can do the spots. You can do them a month at a time. And you can extend that out. You could make it 500 for 3 months or, whatever.
Right.
You could do it that way. But that just seemed to me, I'd always kind of thought of Patreon as kind of, hey, those onesie twosies, $3, $5, that kind of stuff. But Nick's kind of turned that into corporate sponsorship, which is pretty cool.
The thing that also works about that, to a certain extent, depending on how often you do a show, is you will know when that person drops as a sponsor. Because you'll see, you get notified, so-and-so has changed their patronage from, $5 to $10. So I'm assuming if they go from $2.50 to nothing, you would get a notice of that. And then you could then say, hey, we have a new open slot for a sponsor. If you'd like to be the sponsor for May, go on over and sign up. So that way you don't have a gap of no sponsor this month. So that would be something
yeah, lots of good things you could do with that. I think it just makes that administration of it. We have a sponsor that's annual now that just kicks in for our mobile app. And I always have to remember, like, when is that? When's it due? And have I billed them recently? And, with a monthly kind of month-to-month sponsorship. And I've heard a lot, and I think I've heard it from you. I've heard of a lot of folks putting in affiliate ads when they start their podcast so that they have these advertising slots in there already built into their audience. By the way, I think it's a good idea. Like if you're starting a new show and you want to advertise it and you want to monetize it, get those advertising spots in there early, even if they're affiliate placeholders, to get your audience used to. You can always pull away sponsors, but putting them in can sometimes be difficult to your listeners.
I did the math once when Fitbits first came out. I got one and just absolutely loved it. And I set up logicalloss.com/Fitbit. And I was making $9 a Fitbit every time somebody signed up, because those things were going for like $100. They'd give you 10%. I was getting some really nice, and I finally went back and did the math. It was like $52 CPM, which at the time was like, wow, I never heard of that.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I'll take that. And so that's just a matter of finding the right product for your audience. And I still make commissions on because I still wear one. I love it. And it's all about finding the right thing. I know last week 2 weeks ago, I forget, whenever, on the School of Podcasting, I interviewed Joe from Stacking Benjamins, and he did that. He had
good interview, by the way.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying how he had, I think it was hotels.com. And he went through and just treated it like, made sure he read all the fine print that they were allowed to say that. And then used them because he knew eventually he was going to have sponsors. Then the other thing he did is he gave a real low price to Fidelity, because in the finance world, that's like gold. And so he said he was able to say, Stacking Benjamins brought to you by Fidelity Investments, blah, blah, blah. And he said that just made them look so much bigger. He goes, meanwhile, it's just a couple guys in the basement or whatever. So
yeah, it was a good it just gave us some insight. And let's circle back around to what you started with on Patreon, because I think this is an interesting conversation. So you said do your Patreon subscribers, or whatever that means. Does it matter how many people you have in your podcast, or whatever that conversation is? And anyways, is there a direct correlation between your audience and your Patreon? So Dave, let's just compare between you and I, because I think we have good audience size, and I think we're pretty transparent about that. So when we think about Ask the Podcast Coach, how many patrons subscribe to this show, and then how many total listens do we get each week? Do you think? Can you?
Okay.
What
Yeah.
are those two?
1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. More than I thought. 21, 22. Thank you, Mike Moody, for just showing up. 21, 22, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 33. And we get, well, here, let's just do this live. I want to say, and here's what's cool. I used to say we got about 300 downloads an episode. And I haven't, it's one of those things, I'm unlike the typical podcaster where I don't go crazy with the stats. And we're now averaging over 500 downloads an episode. Let me double check here. Okay. Last episode, 593. The one before that is now 633. One before that, 417. What are you going to do? 543, 520, 773. How many ads can you tolerate? 773, 549, 655. So we're easily over 500 every episode now. So that was didn't realize that.
How many Patreons?
33.
33 or so. Okay.
So let's do the math on that. Let's just go with 500.
Okay.
So 33 divided by 500 is 6.6%. That is, in my opinion, a good rate, because I usually say 3 to 5 is good, and we're at 6.5, 6.6.
Now let's contrast that to Home Gadget Geeks. Okay. So a show, I have 300 and some episodes. I think we have 100 and what are we on here? 150, 170?
We're closing in on 170.
Okay, so 170. So about half the number of shows. We're on Saturday mornings. We're a topic lists in the sense of that we're making up topics as we go. Home Gadget Geeks, twice the viewers. So I get 1,000, let's say 1,200, something like that to Home Gadget Geeks. And that's been pretty consistent for 3 or 4 years.
Nice.
I work Patreon like you do. I mention it on my show every week. I mention it twice, once in the beginning, once at the end. Folks can join us. I have plans, $1, $5, whatever. Boom. I'm at about 15. So about half of what we get here. And yet I have twice the downloads. So I think it really has to do with engagement, right? I mean, I don't think there's a direct correlation. We've seen here the audience for Ask the Podcast Coach is engaged in a way and engaged with you in a way. By the way, I don't get anything from Patreon from Dave. It's all Dave's. So we settled that early in the podcast, and I'm okay with that, right? That's the way.
I was going to say, are you still fine with that? Because
that's the way I want it.
It's easy to say when we're making nothing.
No, well, it's true. That's true. No. This is your show, right? I get the privilege of being on it, and I just really have a lot of fun showing up on Saturday mornings. And I'd quit if I didn't. This allows me, by the way, if one day, Dave, I'm like, screw it, I don't have anything else to talk about.
Yeah.
And Dave, I'm going to call you and say, we're done. Like, I'm done, and I don't have any financial obligation to it. So that freedom for me is being able to walk away anytime I want. I'm not planning on walking away anytime soon, but I don't think there's a direct correlation between audience and Patreon. I think the listeners here are maybe twice as engaged, and I don't know if I can say it that way because they're given twice as much, but it matters how engaged they are in what they're doing. And maybe because we have a podcast savvy audience, because they know they're podcasters and we know we live and die by some of this Patreon stuff, maybe they're more generous that way because they understand. My tech listeners, they can, whatever, you're a podcaster, you're doing fine, Jim. The other thing is I don't put a big emphasis on it, and you don't really either, but I'm kind of like, hey, if you want to contribute, that's just a way to do it. People ask me for it, it's there. So I don't make a big deal about it. So I think it matters how you advertise it. I think it matters how you talk about it. And then I think it kind of matters on your audience. And if you're podcasting to a bunch of, young people, they may not have the disposable income, but if your target audience is 35 to 55 professionals who have disposable income, who will support you in that kind of way, maybe you'll get more.
Yeah, I think I've heard some people do Patreon like it's a favor. Like, hey, if you don't mind, if you got some extra couch, change, if you could throw it my way, that'd be cool. And then you have other people who are like, look, if you want this show to continue, it runs on you and you have to donate. It's kind of like, look, if you want me here, if I'm delivering value, then by doggone it, you got to do this if you want to keep this on the air, which is a kind of a PBS kind of thing. We run on donations, and if you want to keep the show going, you got to donate, and it only costs $1, and then you go into the whole spiel kind of thing. So I think that's the other thing too. It's a hard thing to do, because I know the minute anybody thinks about this, the phrase I always hear is, "Oh man, you mean I got to beg for money?" And it's like, yeah, kind of, because it's either way. You're either begging for money or you're begging for somebody to go buy something from somebody else. It's the same, you're just taking the middleman out of the picture.
Yeah, well, you're selling your value, right? And from that standpoint, how and I think when people think about your show, and if it went away, they have to ask the question, what would I pay for that not to happen? And so, I look at some of my Patreon subscribers. My most is $10. By the way, I don't have a $10 plan. So my most is 10. Somebody has upped their thing on their own. And I think
That's cool.
I think you mentioned that too. Was that you? Or maybe it was Nick. It was Nick on Podcasters Group Therapy. He had said some guy had just given him a big chunk, $100 or something like that. And, Nick, it wasn't necessarily a plan. It wasn't even to advertise. It was just to be. And so you could have some very generous subscribers. So I have one, and then, I've got some 6s and some 5s, and all I have is a $5 and a $1 plan. So I've got a 6 and a whole bunch of 5s and some 3s and some 1s. No, do I even have any 1s? No, I have no 1s. So it kind of runs the gamut. And I just think my listeners feel, that it's worth $3 a month to make that Patreon pledge. And last week we read each one of the names, or this week, I guess it'll be coming out this weekend. We read each one of the names. I don't do that all the time, Dave. I probably do that once a quarter or so when we have time to kick it in. So I think that's a good thing too, is to recognize them on the show. Everybody loves to have their name be heard, right?
Yeah, I just realized one of the things I need to do is, like, Mike Moody just joined up for $1. Well, Mike Moody's name needs to go on the page, because it says for a certain level, I have to make sure Mike's in that thing. But for a certain level, you get your name on our page. And that just means it's one of those things of integrity. You can't say, if you do this, you get this and that. And so you do have to kind of keep an eye on that, because some people, and it's fine, some people will go up in their pledge and other people will go down. And that's, don't take that personally, because you never know what's going on in somebody's life. They might have had a baby or something, and something's going on, and
totally,
that whole 9 yards.
So Jason Bryant said in the chat room, I had a guy bump from 20 a month to 100 after I met him for some beers. He knew my area because of my weather tweet. Again, the weather tweet. Like, I saw Chris Nessie, who's out there. He just started tweeting the weather too. And
I'm wearing Chris's shirt today.
Yeah, awesome. It's incredible, that water cooler conversation tweet and I'm noticing I'm seeing a few more of them pop up, where I still get an interaction a week, maybe 2. On the stinking weather, people pop in and it gives me a chance to talk to them, and it's automated and it's easy to do. It's actually how we open our show on Home Gadget Geeks. I'll always say, in a beautiful or in a stormy or in a snowy or in a blistering Bellevue, Nebraska, when I start the show. And then I kick it over to Mike Weger. He lives in town here too. And so we talk for just a minute about what's going on, a little banter back and forth. And it's just funny how that weather draws people together. So pretty interesting.
Well, for anybody wondering, Jim, how do you automate the weather tweet?
Yeah, if this then that is the easiest way to do it. They have a weather, they have a kind of a weather service. Well, I don't forget what they call those things. Recipes? No, they just changed it to something different.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Whatever it is. And so you just go, there's a little schedule, and it says at 9 a.m. I do it first thing in the morning. At 9 a.m., tweet the weather for this zip code. And you just set up a recipe and run it every day. So every day on my Twitter at 9, I think it's 9, it could be 10 a.m., something like that. It says, hey, it's going to be sunny. Like yesterday, it was the high was 42 and the low was 40. And I got this tweet back, wow, not much variance in the weather, Jim, kind of thing. And hey, no, it starts this Twitter conversation, right? It gives me an excuse to have a conversation with some of my listeners. I like it. It's one of those crazy things that just works. And I hashtag it weather nerd. And I find other people who pick up on that hashtag and are like, look, another weather nerd, So it's little things like that. Find your thing. First of all, steal that one if you want to do it. If you want to tweet the weather, do it. But find your thing on Twitter. It's a great way to advertise yourself, get the conversation going.
Alexa, what's the temperature outside?
Currently, in Cuyahoga Falls, it's 59 degrees with cloudy skies. Today, you can expect rainy weather, with a high of 62 degrees and a low of 54 degrees.
Which means Dave is not going to be riding his bike today. That's
a little chilly.
Yeah.
Jason says he puts a subscribe link to his weather in his tweet too, if you want to do that. Yeah, you could load a link of some kind. Even I don't advertise Home Gadget Geeks in it, but I probably should. That's probably a good idea to get that done. So you could put little things, like I put hashtags in them and stuff. But yeah, it's just a kind of a greget way to get to roll the conversation. So
you never know. Hey, we did have a question here. This is from a longtime listener and member of the School of Podcasting, Kim Craggy from let's see, what website shall we promote? Toastmasters101.net. None of my previous podcast interviews are over 15 minutes. That's by design. She says, I'll break up an interview into multiple parts to keep it at the 15-minute limit. Now I've got an interview that just won't break into parts. It wasn't a very successful interview, as in I didn't get the answers I was hoping for, but the content is very important to my audience. That's an interesting statement right there. It's not very good, but it's important to my audience. So like, okay. The interview plus comments plus opening and closing will push this closer to 25 to 27 minutes. And again, normally she's looking for 15 or less. So it's nearly double. Does this matter? I could literally take this interview and drop it into a program with little or no editing because the guest was that good. Again, I scratched my head because a minute ago she said she didn't like the answers, but the guest was good. So is this a case where she got, I wish she was around. She could, again, if you want to join, askthepodcastcoach.com/join. She says, what's your advice? So for me, I'm always of the school of, although I am changing my mind on this, and that is there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. So if the guest is good, let it go. But I do like the Joe Saul-Sehy idea of interviews, and that is he keeps his short so that like my interview with Joe, that was the whole interview. That was the whole episode. So if you like to tune in to get a lot of Dave in that episode, you don't like that no matter how good the interview with Joe was, because there was very little Dave in that. So I like his idea of having short interviews. And then if you don't like this guest, because they're talking about whatever, cross-country ballroom dancing, it's all right. Wait 10 minutes and there'll be another topic about something else. So I like that idea of doing short interviews. And I might do that in the future. If I interview somebody, and then what I'll do is I'll interview them once. And at the end of it, I'll go, okay, now we're going to do this. Hey, Jim, it was great having you on the show. I would love to have you back. Would you like to come back? And which Jim would then say,
yeah, sure. I'd love to.
Great. And then I would go, hey, Jim, thanks for coming back on the show. And Jim would say,
I don't know what I'd say.
It's great to be here, Dave.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry.
And I take, or
I don't know where you're going with this, so sorry.
But the cool thing, now I have those clips. Now I have the big long interview.
I got you, yeah.
But I've got the coming and going. So all I have to do now is anytime I want, I could make that a 3-part episode and go, hey, today I talked to Jim and we talked a lot about Patreon. And, in the future, I want to have Jim come back because he's got some great insights about long interviews. And maybe we'll talk about that. I can do that anytime. I don't have to call him and schedule it.
Totally.
Bam, bring it in. And now I've got my cool little 5-minute. So I might start doing that. I like that. That's one of those things where I'm like, I might do that. So what are your thoughts on long interviews?
Yeah. We've even re-recorded the introduction and the first question when you have an interviewee who's super tight. So you've done those interviews. The first couple questions are they're just tight. They're cold. They're nervous. And you do that, like you said, you may even get that answer like I just gave you, where you're like, hey, how's it going? And I'm like, I got nothing, right? Well, you don't want that in your show. So at the end of the show, when everything's loose and relaxed, say, hey, I'm just going to introduce you again, and this is going to be the one we're going to cut this out and put this up front. And so you're also looser. And so that introduction may be a lot better. If it's not, then at least you have 2 to choose from, and you can get that. The guest will then know kind of what's going on. So if they flubbed the intro to begin with, then you can bring them back in. And I'd even go so far as to re-ask that first question. Because almost every time we've done it, the guest is like, oh, thank goodness, there were some things I wanted to say that I didn't. And so that way you get this really dynamite first question. Because if you're going to keep somebody or lose somebody, you're going to lose them in that first minute, right? They're going to get in there, and if the guy's like, your guest does that, I can listen. There's better podcasts to listen to. But if it's a dynamite first question and they sound comfortable, then bring in, then splice that into the rest of it. I just can't tell you how that really changes the tone of the podcast when you do it that way. So that's a little trick, Dave. Redo the intro, redo the first question, do it at the end when everybody's loose, and then bring it forward in editing.
Yeah, what I do now is when I do the interview, I try to start off the actual interview, with the phrase, thanks for coming on the show. And then I pause before I do my first question. That way, like you said, if the first question is like, blah, blah, blah. Tell me about your favorite color, blah, blah, blah. Okay, blah, blah, nothing. And then, 3 questions in, we start to get to the meat stuff. I'm going to whack those first 2 questions because my audience really doesn't care how they're doing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
No, totally. That's another great idea, is to have those plant questions you're going to rip out, and then go in with that. You could even do it, like if you want to get a really good solid, hey, thanks for being here, do that even before you start recording. I mean, be recording, don't get me wrong. But just say, hey, Dave, I'm really glad. I just want to say, hey, thanks for coming out today. I really appreciate it. And you'll say, oh, it was great to be here. Thanks, in a very relaxed mode, right? Then use that one in the interview. But if that's the importance of recording everything, but don't tell them you're recording everything.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, she said some parts that, she didn't like the answer she got. That's where I think you have to listen through the ears of your audience to go, okay, am I going to keep that or not? And this is a good problem to have. Joe's just one of those guys that we click. He takes his topic very seriously, but he's very sarcastic. And so we have a lot of fun making each other laugh when he's in town. So when I got him on the show, we must have talked, I'm going to bet easy, because I remember him saying, I've got a builder coming over at a certain amount of time. He goes, so, unless we end up talking for like almost 2 hours, he goes, we don't have a problem. Well, we almost talked for 2 hours because we're just having fun and this and that. So now I've got like an hour and 20 minutes worth of interview. And usually my interviews are 40 minutes or less. And I was like, okay, how do I slice this almost in half? And so what I kept looking for was, if I asked a question, where does Joe actually start to answer the question? And a classic and that doesn't mean his answer was bad, but I was like, look, I need the Reader's Digest condensed version of that. So I asked him, I said, there are times, because he always says it's live from Joe's basement. And I said, there was one time where I actually heard the sound of somebody coming down the steps. Are you actually doing this in your basement? And he said, I love that question because it's the theater of the mind. And when I have my audience ask me that question, I always pause and go, yes. And he goes, but really it's the magic of Steve Stewart. That's the answer. The magic of, you know what I mean? So I cut that whole thing about, I love that people think that. I just got right. So it's not that was a bad answer, but I was kind of trying to cut it down. So I just went to, that's the magic of Steve Stewart, yada, yada, yada. So sometimes you just got to cut out the fluff. Or my favorite is, you're trying to think of the next question. So there's this awkward pause and the guest does what I call an over answer, where they'll start, you're not saying anything. So they're like, and that's why, and then they basically repeat themselves.
Yeah.
And I'll go in and I'll whack
cut that part out. You can prep your guest for that, by the way. You can say in the very beginning of the interview, hey, before we get started here, there's going to be some moments where I may put a pause in there. Don't feel the need to fill that space.
Yep.
It's just for me as I'm regrouping, and it makes for a better interview. And so you can kind of prep them. You kind of prep them that way. Dave, one of the things I've noticed on school podcasting that you're doing that I'm really liking, that I think is handy, and Jeff, as you come in here, we'll get to you in just a second, is you've always had some sound effects, but now you're being very judicious about them. So you're not overdoing it, but maybe there's one or two, you add one or two sound effects to your podcast each week, but you're not overdoing it. And you're being strategic and judicious about the way you put them in. So they're meaningful. It might be somebody says something that's worth cheering for, and you'll put a little, behind the scenes or whatever, but not doing that every time. And I've really appreciated just having one or two of those a podcast. And so that's kind of a nice way when you talk about theater of the mind. I think that's a nice way to do it, but you can overdo it as well. So we have Jeff joining us. Let's bring him in.
Let's bring in Jeff, shall we? Ladies and gentlemen, speaking of sound effects. So Jeff, you are currently muted, it looks like. There he's not.
There he is.
Yeah. How you doing?
Hey, buddy.
Guys?
Good. How are you, man?
I'm good. So quick question for you guys is, I'm just joining in, but did you guys see the podcasting, what was it called? It was the the podcasting, oh Jesus.
That's all right. Take your time.
The best podcasting practices, that whole article of the I forget who did it.
The Bridge Report.
Yes. I don't know if you talked about that earlier or not, but
there are some things in there that number one, Dave Van Dyke.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those things that I always, how can I say this? It's interesting. Like, I'll give you an example of something. How would you take it if I gave you advice on how to ride a unicycle? And I said, here's what you have to do. You have to maintain your balance, and you have to make sure to blah, blah, blah. There's only one problem with that, Jeff.
You don't know how to ride a unicycle.
I've never ridden a unicycle. So when I get a lot of feedback from somebody who, now I've ridden a bicycle, I've ridden a tricycle, I've ridden a moped. So I have all sorts of feedback and experience with things with wheels. I've ridden in an 18-wheel truck, but I've never ridden a unicycle. Dave Van Dyke is an experienced guy. He's worked for all sorts of big old companies with CBS and radio and radio and radio. But I can't listen to the Dave Van Dyke podcast. That is my whole take on that. Dave, now he does say there's a thing, and for those of you that listen to the School of Podcasting, I'm going to talk about this on the School of Podcasting. But he does say this, the best practices, be organized and know where the podcast is going. Jim just mentioned this about the beginning of the show. Be considerate of your audience's time and don't ramble. I'm doing a show right now. I'm playing with another platform called the Podcast Rodeo Show. And I literally pick a random show. And I really thought I'll probably get a clinker every 3 or 4. I think I have one that I go, I would listen to this show. And now some of that is very easy. I'm not the target audience they're looking for, but there are a lot of things that I'm like, oh man, I can't believe. I'll give you an example. A comedian was doing a show and she brought on one of her comedian friends. Mm-hmm. And she's like, okay, so here's what we're going to do in the show. We're going to do this thing, and then we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about that. And I'm like, this would have been a great interview or a great conversation to have before you pressed record. I'm like, why are you explaining the show as like, and I'm just sitting there going, where's the funny? Come on. Your description said you're funny, witty. And then they finally, there was a guy that brought on this doctor. Now it's a show about how to specialize in the medical field, because it's really hard to pick your specialty as a doctor because, well, you're busy going to school. And I'm not making this up. This guy gave this guy like a 30-second intro. Like he was the master of the universe. He's the king of all media. He's the blah, 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 and the blah. And he studied with the so-and-so and he did. I mean, it went on and on. And I'm like, okay, I get it. The guy's smart. And he's did this. And he just kept going. And finally he goes, welcome, Dr. Vandenbeek, to the show. And the guy's like, thank you, Biff, for having me on the show. And he goes, is there anything we missed in your bio? And I'm like, are you kidding me? It's like, let the expert, he's here. Let's get to the, so to me, I think that's one of the key things is I think people are blowing the intro. I really, that's the whole point of the show was how long can I hang on? And the answer is, and I almost want to rename it Dave's an Impatient Podcast Listener, because that's kind of what it's boiling down to. And I feel bad because I like to encourage people, and it really is any kind of criticism for these people. It's based out of a sense of kind of like, I want to help you kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But I'm really worried that I'm going to start sounding like the two old guys in the balcony of the Muppets. You know what I mean? Where I'm like, what are they doing? Yeah, kind of thing. Yeah. So,
Jeff, was there anything in there you saw that surprised you, or that, I mean, obviously it motivated you enough to join us and jump in. So what was there something you saw in there?
I mean, honestly, there was just so much different controversy going along with it. I mean, some people felt that it was useful. Other people felt that it wasn't. I just kind of wanted your take on it. There was nothing crazy in there that caught my attention per se. It was just another one of those reports that people have very differing opinions on. I just wanted to hear what you guys thought on it. But, that's basically it. I just wanted to hear what your guys' opinion was with it.
Well, the one that makes everybody go, ugh, at least it makes me go, ugh. Let's not throw everybody here. He even put it in giant bold letters. The average time spent with podcasts is 22 minutes with listeners who commit beyond the first 5 minutes. So first of all, there are people that are bailing for the first 5 minutes. Why? Because you won't let the expert And then the average podcast is 22 minutes. And what I'm worried about that is people translate that into my podcast has to be 22 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
To which I asterisk, if you want them to listen to the whole thing in one sitting. He does say down here, the session, he even has that in quotation mark, average of 22 minutes also reflects partial podcast consumption, i.e. podcasts of longer length are often listened to in 2 or more sessions. Now, I'll give you a classic example. Daniel just did an episode. Daniel, if you could, is it 3 hours? I need to get this stat right. I want to say it was 3 hours long. He did episode 301, and it was his 10 years in podcasting. And he brought his wife on. We had Noodle Baby in the background making cool baby sounds. Mm-hmm. And I want to say, 3.5 hours long.
Yeah.
Now every day I sit on my butt and I do Libsyn tickets, but I get up usually around 10:30 and I walk around the block. I walk around the block on my lunch. I walk around the block usually around 3 o'clock. So I get up and try to do something just to get up and not sit on my butt all day. Yeah. And when I do that, I listen to podcasts. So I listen to Daniel's show over the span of 2 days, 10 minutes here, 45 minutes here, another 10 minutes there, another 10 minutes here, another 45 minutes here, and another 10 minutes there. So it took me 2 days to get through it. So that's where I go to the old Valerie Geller quote, there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, there's 2 things when I read that part that I knew it wasn't important. The first one is back in college when I was taking I was doing a radio club, and the guy that was running the radio club is a 25-year veteran in that he's been on syndicated programming. His voice is still around in intros and stuff, and he had one thing where he goes, how long should the bit be? Meaning, how long should the section of your conversation be for the radio? And the answer is as long as it needs to be.
That's it.
And the second thing that I knew that the 22-minute thing was kind of malarkey was Rob Walsh on the feed recently was talking about how he pulled together all of the numbers and stuff and compared the length of show for all these shows that have at least 100,000 downloads or more, and I think it was like less than 10% were less than 30 minutes, and then shows that were over 2.5 hours was more than that.
Yeah.
So more people are listening to longer shows than they are to shorter shows. So it was just interesting to sort of hear Rob basically debunk the whole 22-minute episode kind of thing. Yeah. So when I read that, I knew it wasn't accurate.
Well, the thing, and the other thing I kind of want to ask both Nielsen and in this case Bridgeport, they're calling people, and they even say, like, I forget what the stat was. There's a large number of people that they're polling that do not have a smartphone, and I'm kind of like, I would love them to like let's find the people who are actually listening to podcasts. Let's do a study of just those people, as opposed to random people who happen to be listening. I mean, I think it was 2,000 people, but it's interesting. And to me, it's again, the difference between broadcasting. And I always say broadcasting is like that conversation you have with somebody. If you're still going to the post office, right? If I go to the post office in Cleveland, I'm like, hey, how about those Cavs last night? You know what? LeBron's just bringing it to the rim. And the guy's going to go, yeah, man, he's awesome. Okay. Now we had a conversation. But how deep was that conversation? I could have that with anybody. Sure is hot today. Whoo, you working hard or hardly work or not? All those stupid little conversations that you have. But that's not a very deep conversation. And to me, podcasting is all about that deep conversation. Now we're going to talk about blank. We're going to go, knee deep into Patreon or whatever the heck we're talking about. And those, I don't think people mind going longer because they're really getting that, now we're getting into the chewy center of a Tootsie Pop. We looked through all the flavors, and now we're to the chocolate. Okay, well, I'll do that. So
yeah, you're getting value, and that's the number one thing.
Yeah. Where is my?
I think the way the audience listens matters, and I know we've talked about this for the Gallup podcast, and I get every new person that joins Gallup, and then we start talking about the podcast, and they've listened to it, and they're like, they'll always say, "Man, I love what you do, but." Man, they're just long. And they're 45 minutes, right? And I'll say, well, how do you listen to them? And they're like, well, I hear at work. And I'm like, have you ever listened to it in your car? How long is your commute? And so they'll say, well, 25 minutes, let's say. I said, so you could get one episode home and working back, would you listen to the whole episode in your car? Oh, well, yeah. And so I'm trying to train my listeners, like for the long play stuff, guys, listen to this when you're traveling, or listen to it when you're walking the dog, or listen to it when you're commuting or whatever. We're not going to try and take 45 minutes worth of content and jam it into 7 minutes just because you have ADD. Like there's a lot of good content here. So you need all 45 minutes. Let's figure out ways for you to consume it in that 45-minute span that works for you. No one's going to sit at their desk and watch a YouTube video for 45 minutes learning that kind of way. I mean, it's just really hard to do. But
if they want to keep their job.
True, right? They feel guilty and they're like, oh, I should be doing something else. Even though our stuff is really work related, it's hard to sit there for 45 minutes. Although, is it? A lot of people, I listen to John Oliver all the time on YouTube, and I can just spend hours listening to that guy, right? So content matters, but two, find ways for them to consume it where they can do it in their normal course of the day, whether it's, like all those activities. I don't want people to bow to the almighty of, we got to make it short. We got to make everything has to be 3-minute unboxing videos where there's candy and confetti. It's like, come on, guys. Not everything has to be a party. There's some great content out there. So let's just get to it. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. Daniel has the stat. 84% of podcasts with more than 100,000 downloads per episode are longer than 51 minutes.
I mean, that's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Jason says, so what were the kind of shows that get more than 100,000 downloads per episode? Maybe those kinds of shows make sense to go long. Perhaps other shows have different audiences who prefer shorter shows. Well, that's true. I mean, the big one, of course, you have Mark Maron, I think, is longer than 51 minutes most of the time. Mm-hmm. Hardcore History, is insane. I mean, that guy's shows are like 6 hours long. But they're most of them. I think most of the top interview shows. And again, that doesn't mean interview shows equals downloads. But, if you go into Radio Lab and I'm about done with Startup. I'm kind of bummed that the core of Startup, which used to be about Gimlet Media, that show might as well now be This American Life. It's just cool stories about other companies, but I wanted to know about Gimlet Media. You pulled me in and I got tied to Gimlet Media, and now you're not talking about Gimlet Media anymore. And I listened to Startup yesterday and I said, I think I'm done with the show. Speaking of shows, Jeff, what are you up to these days?
I am working on a new show. I'm working on a ton of different stuff actually right now, but the show I have now is the Podcast Brief. And it's basically, 5 days a week, you'll be getting podcasting news in the space in the podcast. And I'm actually doing two big things here coming up in the next coming weeks. I don't have a set date for this yet, but I'm going to actually be having interviews on top of the news section of it. So you'll be getting, podcasting news 5 days in 5 minutes less, 7 days a week, plus an interview once a week as well. And then the second thing is I'm doing this Twitter chat next Wednesday, the 3rd of May. And if you join me at the Podcast Brief, I'll be asking questions about pain points and things like that. And people can engage with me on that and just use the hashtag PodChat, PODCHAT, and you can engage there. But there's going to be like 6 or 7 different questions about podcasting pain points, and people can join the conversation there.
Nice. So we've got the Podcast Brief. Matthew Passy has the Podcast Bulletin,
mm-hmm.
and you have me with Podcast Newsflash. So if you want podcast, and then of course there's Pod to Pod.
Yeah.
So that seems to be cool. More people getting into the podcast news scheme. So what's the website for the Podcast Brief?
Just go to thepodcastbrief.com.
There we go. Very cool. Any other thoughts on the Bridge Report before we move on?
Nothing specific on the Bridge Report, but in my personal opinion, everybody that has these articles and stuff, when it comes to here's what you need to do with your podcast, don't listen to them wholeheartedly, because the reason I say that is podcasting has always and forever will be a free form media. And when people try and put you into a box, you will never really be able to figure out what the full potential of your show is if you're following somebody else's regimen to make your show work.
Jeff brings up a really good point. I wanted to talk about this. To a certain extent, podcasting is an art, man. It's my art. And there was a thing in a Facebook group from Tom Ballard. He says, I just got off the phone with a blogger podcaster looking for help. He has over 5,000 downloads per weekly episode, a great topic, and nearly 10,000 in his private Facebook group. But he isn't making more than $20 a month. Now, for the record, again, we always need to say you don't have to make money with your podcast, but this guy's making $20 a month. Every single suggestion I made was met with total rejection, as in, it doesn't work, Dave, if you don't leave the volume up. There we go. Total rejection. And he says, I make everything. What a draining conversation. It's the first and last conversation we will ever have. Oh, and we didn't meet through this group. Joining the group was another idea. He said it was a total waste of time. The funny part is I can find dozens in his niche who are making a living in his traffic, with his traffic alone. I love reaching out and networking with others, but I'd rather shave my head with a cheese grater than repeat that conversation. So,
Yikes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting. I have somebody that contacted me via my chat, and they said, I want to start a podcast, yada, yada, yada. I want it to be something. I want it to stand out. I want to have amazing success, and I want to have a lot of downloads. And I jokingly put back and said, wow, we have a lot in common. What podcaster is starting a podcast going, well, I want to be boring. I want to get no downloads. I think we all want that, but I also, here's the thing. How do you know, to me, it's like you have to know your audience. That's the key. You have to know your audience. And I can tell you that you have to know your audience, but you probably know your audience better than me. And he said, coughing. And that's where, I don't know. I think it's where it all starts, because I can't, you might have really good art. And for me, I'm like, puh. But if it's engaging with your audience, then engage. I don't know. Do you think, because I don't think anybody's willing to change their show. And I understand why, because we all work really, really hard on our shows, but I don't think podcasters are open to suggestions. What do you guys think?
Go ahead, Jeff. What do you think?
Yes and no. I think inherently people don't want to be told that their art or their baby is ugly. But at the same time, if you were to get positive criticism from somebody of, I like your show, or your show is interesting, here's what you can do to make it better, in my opinion, you can take that and go with it. But I think when somebody comes into your house and tells you that you need to have your house arranged in this specific way, everything that you have in there is wrong, it's going to be a lot harder for somebody to be receptive of that than it is for somebody to be like, hey, why don't we just move the couch from here to where you can actually see the TV? Yeah. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think people always receive it better when they ask you first. So, when Jeff, if you had jumped in and said, hey, what do you guys think about this? I do this in my podcast. And Jeff, I listened to your older stuff and gave you even some feedback, and it told you, I really liked the progression that you made from the very beginning of the show towards where you stopped to retool. You made some improvements. But if you're asking me and I'm telling you, that's one thing. If I'm just coming to you saying, and that's user feedback, right? Even though we've asked for it, we haven't always asked for it, and we have to be open to hear it from them. So I do think there's this balance in there where we've got to make some changes when our listeners have great ideas and great suggestions. Certainly my listeners have really honed and shaped my show, and some things like, oh God, don't ever do that again. Well, I got to think about that. And then there's times, I've had some folks on where we've done maybe like some community service ones where I bring them in just to talk about great stories, and it's not necessarily totally tech related. I'm going to do that whether they want me to or not, because I think it's the right thing to do. But there's been some things I've tried before and they're like, don't. And I think those are important things to listen to. So, we've got to take it. We have to take it with a grain of salt and say, what are we going to gain out of this? And it is difficult, but it's not easy. If you're going to put yourself, I had a listener who I was fighting back on. He kept sending me suggestions on things I didn't really want to listen to. And at one point I kind of said, hey dude, I'm going to do this whether you like it or not. And he sends me a note like, why the hostility? If your skin is so thin that you can't take this feedback, maybe you shouldn't be podcasting. And I kind of had to think, yeah, okay, I got a little thin there,
Well, I think there's there's audience feedback, but if somebody said, Dave, I really think this show shouldn't be from 10:30 to 11:30. You should make it from 10:30 to 11. This show's too long. Okay, I'll take that feedback. There's only one thing. I'm doing an hour-long show. That's the bottom line. Actually, we do an hour and a half if you count the post show. And so if you feel it's too long, I understand why you would think that. But my goal of the podcast is to be an hour long with a half hour for post show. So if that's too long, I would understand if you don't want to listen anymore. So you have to kind of, there are ways to say it, I think, then, and it's not that I don't appreciate your feedback, but I'm doing an hour long show.
Well, Dave, and we'll attract people who want to listen for an hour after a while, right? When your show is early, that's when you have the best chance to make the changes that actually make a difference. The longer you go, the more you lock in your current listeners. And so I bet a lot of our listeners listen to us when they're traveling or in a shop or an area where they're not listening all the time. I know many of the live folks are doing other things while they're listening to us, but they listen to us every week and they're listening for something that they're interested in. And we become a little bit of background noise from that standpoint. So you begin to attract it. If we had all of a sudden jammed this down to 15 minutes and said, okay, we're just going to do the best 15 minutes we can do, and it's going to be well rehearsed and well produced, right? We're going to attract a totally different audience. And eventually that audience would grow based on that format. And so we attract audience listeners based on what we do. And eventually, that's why if you jack around with your format all the time, man, listeners get really disgruntled because they get used to a certain way. I don't know. Jeff, when you switched, did you get any feedback? I mean, you didn't, your switch wasn't that drastic, but it was pretty drastic.
I mean, the one part that I got like the most feedback was when I moved from being an interview-based show to being a more narrative-based show where I take those interviews and tell the story with them. By the way, that's coming back in the podcast brief.
Oh, good.
Podcast roots.
I like that. You do that well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And when I did that, I got nothing but positive reception. I had somebody that I didn't even know in my real life that listened to the podcast call me and go, hey, I really like this format. I had to call you and tell you this. So, I mean, yeah, I got a lot of feedback from it. Most of it was positive. I never really got any negative feedback per se. I haven't had that one guy leaving a comment on my podcast saying that, your show sucks. And, I still haven't hit that milestone yet. I know that's
there's time, buddy. Hang in there.
Yeah, to answer your question, I did get a little bit of feedback, but not a lot. But most of it was positive.
Yeah, Craig in the chat room says sometimes it's hard to know what feedback to incorporate and what to reject. And that to me, it's like, what is the goal of your show? And does this feedback steer you towards your goal? Can you do this feedback, sleep at night, and steer it towards your goal? Because if somebody goes, well, Dave, I think you should give away everything in the school podcasting for free. Okay, I understand that feedback. That does not achieve my goal of paying off student loans and everything else. It makes me a really nice guy, but that's not going to work. So I think that's part of it too. Because I was just listening to an interview with George Carlin, and he said when he started off, he wanted to be an actor. And again, this is probably back in the 50s, early 60s. And he wanted to be Danny Kaye because Danny Kaye was this funny actor at the time. Now, if you know George Carlin, the guy that came up with the 7 dirty words you can't, Danny Kaye was like Mickey Mouse, George Carlin, and he said he was trying to be somebody that he just wasn't. And he said there are a couple appearances, I guess, of him in a suit on an old Ed Sullivan stuff. And he goes, I hate those because I was trying to be something I wasn't. And he says it wasn't. And he said it took him 2 years to figure out what he was going to be and how he kind of thought through it. And so I think that's a big part of it. You have to be, people that try to be John Lee Dumas and I'm going to ignite and I'm going to be intense and I'm going to talk about being stoked. That doesn't come natural to you, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, but there's some great audience advice. I mean, I had somebody who listened say, hey, you got to turn your Amazon affiliate account into the Average Guy Tech Scholarship Fund.
Yeah.
And use it to buy items for your listeners to test and be unbiased and bring it on the show. that was a great idea. In fact, that changed the course of everything I do with affiliate marketing and the way I do it, right? And it was great advice. And I could have easily said, whatever. No, that's for me. That's my money. It's what I do. But he kind of taught me, giving some of that stuff away is the way to do it. And so there are times when your audience comes up with really great suggestions and you should do it. The way you should do it is you should try it, see where it goes. Jeff, you tried a different format, right? That I remember that first time I was listening to the first time you did the more narrative, and you'd even said, hey, this is going to kind of be a different format. We're going to try something different. And I could tell from the tone of your voice, you were kind of unsure if this was going to work.
Oh, dude, when I hit publish, it was like pressing the nuclear buttons. I'm like, is this going to work? Is this going to be okay?
Yeah, and you didn't know.
I finally did, yeah. Yeah,
You
that's
didn't
exactly
know,
what it was.
and you got great feedback on it, right? And you would have never gotten that feedback if you'd never taken a chance and tried it.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, good or bad, I think, is determined by additional audience feedback. You might get some feedback from one of your listeners like, hey, would you really try this for me? And if you try it and you continue to get great feedback from your audience, keep doing it. If you try it and it doesn't work, gently go back to that listener and say, hey, we tried this in the audience. This is the feedback I got. By the way, share your negative feedback with people in your audience that are from other people. And it kind of helps them understand what you're getting, from that standpoint. So anyways, that's a good point, Jeff.
The other thing on that, if it doesn't work, you don't have to let people know, hi, this failed miserably and I'm not going to do this anymore. If you just stop doing it, if it was something that people didn't like, they're not going to go, hey, where's that thing that I used to hate? They're just going to notice that they probably won't notice that it's gone. You just kind of it's like,
just remove it. Just let it go. Don't
let it go.
Don't point it out.
That goes back to my days of being in bands. You'd hit the wrong note. And what we had the last band I was in that did really well, we had a joke. We said, look, if you make a mistake on stage, just look and smile at each other. And so I'd be playing. It used to drive me nuts. My bass player would get high and on the last set. So he was always making mistakes. And when a bass player makes mistakes, nobody notices that the bass player made the mistake. It sounds like I'm playing out of key because I'm not playing in the key he is. And I would just look at him and I just want to wring his neck. But I would just smile and go, can we play in G now? Because that's what I'm playing in. But most times the audience didn't know. Right. Whereas if I would have gone, Ryan, what are you doing, you idiot? Yeah, that's not going to work. But if you just smile and kind of like, hey, look, I'm in G, you're in G sharp. That's not going to work. So, holy cow, look at the time. We're going to turn this around on and keep kind of talking this conversation as we go into the post show. But before we do that, holy cow, we forgot to thank our fun-filled patrons. We talked a lot about Patreon today. So we want to thank Josh Rivers from CreativeStudio.Academy. Of course, the one and only Glenn the Geek Hebert from Horse Radio Network. And you can see all of our other supporters over at AskThePodcastCoach.com/awesome. And you can join that. And there's a ton of info behind the scenes that you can get if you sign up today for $1, just like Mike Moody did, and get access to that. And we appreciate everybody who does that. Jeff, since you're here, give yourself a plug. Where's your new show at again?
thepodcastbrief.com.
And Jim, where can people find you?
Oh, everything's at theaverageguy.tv.
Got it. Anything fun coming up on future episodes over there?
Well, we just released this weekend. I just released an interview I did with John Rossman. He worked for Amazon at one point, wrote a book called The Amazon Way of IoT. And so we talked a lot about Internet of Things, and we talked about this partnership between DHL and Audi to deliver packages right to your car.
Ooh, that's kind of cool.
Pretty interesting, huh?
That is some geeky stuff over there. And we might be talking a little Amazon here in the post show as well. I know Jim's got some news on that, but I want to address Jason's question, which is, let's turn this around. When should you offer feedback to the podcaster you listen to, and how should you do that? Boy, do I have an answer for that. So we'll be getting into the post show, but we're here every Saturday at AskThePodcastCoach.com/live. You can find me at schoolofpodcasting.com. Use the coupon code listener and save when you sign up. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the chat room. We'll see you again next week with another fun-filled episode of Ask the Podcast Coach. Now everyone gets to dance.